The sound arrives before the aircraft does. Not the sharp crack of a jet, something lower, something that does not travel so much as press. It moves through the concrete apron at Boscombe Down, Wiltshire, through the soles of boots, up through legs, settling somewhere behind the sternum. The instruments in the control tower begin to vibrate a half-second before the aircraft crosses the threshold of vision. Then it appears. The fuselage is long, longer than anything the Air Ministry has ordered before, white against the grey Wiltshire sky. Its nose pointed down slightly at approach, the way a bird of prey holds its head before the stoop. 2 Bristol Siddeley Olympus engines, each producing 30,110 pounds of thrust with reheat engaged. The undercarriage extends. There is no drama in the landing. The wheels contact the runway and the reverser baffles deploy, and the sound, which was already inside you, increases by another register entirely. A man in the cockpit removes his gloved left hand from the throttle. The aircraft is stopped. It has been airborne for 41 minutes. The date is 27th of September 1964. Nobody knows yet that this is the beginning of the end. In 1964, the English electric TSR-2 was the most technically advanced strike aircraft ever built in Britain. It could fly at Mach 235 at altitude and sustain Mach 1.1 at 200 feet above the ground, below the coverage of Soviet radar systems, while its terrain-following autopilot made the necessary corrections faster than any human pilot could. No strike aircraft built by any nation before or since had combined those 3 capabilities in a single operational airframe. At the moment it left the runway at Boscombe Down for the first time, it was not the best aircraft Britain had ever built. It was the best aircraft of its type that existed anywhere on Earth. Today, 2 airframes remain. The prototype, XR-219, stands in the RAF Museum at Cosford, Shropshire. A second airframe, XR-220, stands at IWM Duxford, Cambridgeshire. Neither has engines fitted. Neither has ever been outside Britain. Neither has ever been within 10,000 miles of the Soviet Union it was designed to penetrate. Both aircraft are silent. 24 test flights. That is the complete operational history of the English Electric TSR-2. The engineers at English Electric's facility at Wharton, Lancashire, told the Air Ministry that their aircraft worked. They were correct. The test reports confirmed it. The performance matched the Air Ministry's own operational requirement, OR 339, point by point. The aircraft was not cancelled because it failed. It was cancelled 6 days after its final test flight, in a budget statement read to the House of Commons by Chancellor James Callaghan on the 6th of April 1965. The aircraft that was ordered to replace it, the American General Dynamics F-111K, was itself cancelled in 1968 before a single airframe was delivered. For 29 years after the TSR-2's cancellation, the Royal Air Force flew the Blackburn Buccaneer, an aircraft designed for a completely different role, in a completely different era, for a completely different service. So the question this episode investigates is not why the TSR-2 failed. It is something more specific. The TSR-2 did not fail. It was cancelled while it was succeeding. Why? What follows is not a tribute to a lost machine. Tributes are offered to things that mattered and then passed naturally from the world. The TSR-2 did not pass naturally from anything. It was terminated by a line in a budget document while its engines were still being serviced for the next test flight. What follows is the forensic record, the design documents, the test reports, the cabinet papers from the National Archives at Kew, the testimony of the men who built it and flew it, and at the end, a verdict. If you want more stories like this, British machines that worked, that were cancelled anyway, and whose absence shaped the country that came after, subscribe. We are building an archive of what Britain built, what it could do, and what ended it. This is the TSR-2. This is episode 1. In 1957, the British government published what became the most destructive single document in the history of British aviation. The Sandys White Paper, named for Defence Secretary Duncan Sandys, declared that the era of the manned combat aircraft was over. Guided missiles would replace fighters. Surface-to-air missiles would replace air defense. The future was automated, and the future had no cockpit. 20 British aircraft programs were cancelled. 20 in a single document. One survived. Not because the political logic failed to reach it, but because there was a specific military requirement that guided missiles, in 1957, genuinely could not fulfill. The RAF needed an aircraft that could penetrate Soviet air defenses, fly deep into Soviet territory in any weather, and deliver a nuclear weapon, or conventional ordnance, with precision. Missiles could reach targets. Only a manned aircraft could find them in a blizzard at treetop height and return. That requirement became Operational Requirement, OR, 339, issued in 1958. The contract to develop an aircraft to meet it was awarded, after a painful and politically contentious competition, to a joint venture between English Electric at Warton, Lancashire, builders of the Lightning Interceptor, and Vickers at Weybridge, Surrey. The combined entity was British Aircraft Corporation. The aircraft it was tasked with building was designated TSR-2, Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance, Mark II. The single engineering decision that made TSR-2 possible, and that made it politically lethal, was the decision to design for low-level supersonic flight as a primary mode of operation. An aircraft traveling at Mach 1.1 at 200 feet is, for the purposes of Soviet ground radar in the early 1960s, effectively invisible. The returns it generates appear as ground clutter and are filtered out before they reach a human operator. The aircraft does not need to outrun the missile. It flies under the missile's entire operational logic. That decision cascaded into every other design choice. The airframe had to be immensely strong to survive the turbulence at low-level high speed, not just structurally, but in terms of fatigue life over repeated missions. The engines had to produce thrust across an enormous range of altitudes and speeds without surging or flaming out. The avionics had to see the terrain coming and make corrections faster than the pilot's nervous system could react. Everything about the TSR-2, the blended delta wing configuration, the slab tailplane, the slab-sided fuselage cross-section, derived from that single decision to fly low and fast and survive. Between the issue of OR 339 in 1958 and the first flight of XR-219 in September 1964, approximately 14,000 engineers, draftsmen, and skilled tradesmen worked across British Aircraft Corporation's facilities at Warton, Weybridge, and subcontractors, including Bristol Siddeley and Filton Bristol and Ferranti in Edinburgh. At its peak, the TSR-2 program was the largest single defence procurement contract in British history, valued at approximately £750 million, a figure that, adjusted for the industrial wage rates of the period, represents a commitment that would be measured in billions today. The Air Ministry's initial requirement was for 138 aircraft. At the pricing structures of 1963, that represented enough work to sustain British Aircraft Corporation's military division for the better part of a decade. The subcontract network extended to Rotherham for forgings, to Sheffield for specialist steels, to Ferranti's plant in Edinburgh, whose engineers were developing the most sophisticated airborne terrain-following radar system in the world. At the moment of its first flight in September 1964, XR-219 carried more integrated electronic systems than any British aircraft before it. The forward-looking radar could map terrain at low level in total darkness or in cloud. The terrain-following autopilot could fly the aircraft at 200 feet without pilot input. The inertial navigation system could deliver the aircraft to a target within a fraction of a nautical mile after a mission of several hundred miles, without reference to any ground station or radio navigation aid. No Soviet air defense system in service in 1964 was designed to defeat an aircraft operating in that envelope. The engineers at Warton knew this. They had built the answer to a question that the RAF had been asking since Korea. The autumn of 1964 should have been the beginning of something. It was, in fact, a peak that nobody present recognized as a peak. That is always how it is. Roland Prosper Beaumont, known universally as Rowley, was 44 years old on the morning he first flew the TSR-2. He was not the test pilot the program had originally envisaged. He was something considerably more inconvenient to dismiss. He held the DSO and bar, the DFC and bar, and a CBE. During the Second World War, flying hurricanes, typhoons, and tempests with 609 Squadron and later in command of 150 Wing, he had destroyed or damaged more than 30 enemy aircraft and had shot down 32 V-1 flying bombs in a single month, finding them at speed in darkness and destroying them before they reached London. After the war, he had become the principal test pilot for English Electric, flying the Canberra jet bomber on its first flight in 1949 and the Lightning supersonic interceptor in 1954. By the time he climbed into XR-219, he had more first-flight experience on British military aircraft than any other pilot alive. He later wrote of that first flight with characteristic Lancastrian understatement. The aircraft handled predictably, and the systems functioned as designed. There was no reason to suppose the program would not meet the specification. There was no reason. The aircraft was right. In 1965, after the cancellation, Beaumont gave testimony to the House of Commons Select Committee on Estimates. A member asked whether the TSR-2 had demonstrated the performance required by operational requirement, or IT 39. Beaumont replied, "It had." That answer was never disputed. Not then, not since. Did you know that? Leave it in the comments. It helps more people find these stories. The engineers who built the TSR-2's terrain-following radar system did not disappear when the program was cancelled. Most of them were working for Ferranti's Edinburgh facility, which had been developing the forward-looking and terrain-following radar under subcontract from British Aircraft Corporation. When TSR-2 died in April 1965, the Ferranti team was retained, not for a British program, but for what would eventually become the Tornado MRCA, the multi-role combat aircraft developed jointly by Britain, West Germany, and Italy. The Tornado GR-1 entered RAF service in 1982. Its terrain-following system, the system that allowed it to fly at 200 feet at high speed in total darkness over the North German plain, which was exactly what it was designed to do, was the intellectual and technical successor to the system the same engineers had built for TSR-2 17 years earlier. The Tornado served the Royal Air Force until 2019. 54 years after the TSR-2 was cancelled, the core technology that had been developed in Edinburgh for a British aircraft that never flew a single operational mission was still guiding British aircraft on operational sorties over Iraq and Syria. The engineering survived. The program did not. The Tornado flew for 37 years in RAF service. The TSR-2 flew for 24 test flights. The same engineering tradition produced both. Only one of them was allowed to work. Did that surprise you? Write it in the comments. The decision to design the TSR-2 for sustained supersonic flight at low level was, in 1958, the correct engineering decision. It was correct because the threat it was designed to defeat was real. The alternative approaches had been evaluated and found wanting, and the specific combination of range, speed, and all-weather capability that OR 339 demanded could not be achieved by any aircraft flying or under development anywhere in the world at that time. The two Bristol Siddeley Olympus 22R engines selected for the TSR-2 produced 30,110 pounds of thrust each with reheat engaged, the same fundamental engine family that would later, in developed form, power Concorde. They were selected because they were the only British power plant that could provide the thrust required across the full operational envelope, from sea-level maximum continuous power through transonic acceleration to sustained Mach 2 at altitude. The choice was not a gamble. It was the product of exhaustive analysis by engineers at English Electric and Bristol Siddeley who understood the specific performance requirements better than anyone in Whitehall. The low-level penetration mode was not a preference or an aspiration. It was the operational logic of the entire program. If an aircraft could not survive in defended airspace at high altitude, and by 1960, after Gary Power's U-2 was destroyed by a Soviet SA-2 missile at 70,000 feet, that proposition was clearly established. Then it had to operate below that defended environment. 200 feet, fast, in all weathers. That was the answer. The engineers at Wharton built the answer. The world for which the TSR-2 was designed reached its maximum coherence somewhere around 1961. In that world, the Soviet air defense network, while formidable at medium and high altitude, was genuinely blind below 500 feet in anything but ideal conditions. In that world, Britain maintained an independent nuclear deterrent based on manned bombers. The Vickers Valiant, the Avro Vulcan, the Handley Page. Victor, whose future depended on maintaining the ability to penetrate Soviet airspace and deliver weapons. In that world, Operational Requirement or 339 made complete sense. It was the logical evolution of everything the V-Bomber Force had established. The Ministry of Supply, which oversaw procurement until it was replaced by the Ministry of Aviation in 1959, had structured the TSR-2 program around the standard British development contract model. A fixed requirement, a cost-plus development phase to establish production feasibility, and a production contract conditional on meeting the specification. The system was imperfect. Cost-plus development contracts carried inherent risk of overrun, but it was the system that had produced the Canberra, the Lightning, and the Vulcan. It was the system the British defense industry knew how to work within. The program's complexity was not a secret. The chief scientist at the Ministry of Aviation, Sir Solly Zuckerman, had flagged the technical risk in 1959, but risk was understood and managed. The terrain-following radar was the most demanding element. It required digital processing speeds that pushed against the limits of contemporary electronics. But Ferranti's team in Edinburgh was making progress that the broader procurement community was not tracking closely enough. That gap between what the engineers knew they could deliver and what the civil servants believed was achievable would prove significant. But in 1961, none of that had resolved into a crisis. The program was progressing, the engineering was sound, the requirement was real. Then the world changed. The Nassau Agreement of December 1962 was the document that killed the TSR-2, though it would take 2 years and 3 months for the death to be formalized. At Nassau, in the Bahamas, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan met President John F. Kennedy to resolve a crisis that had emerged when the United States canceled the Skybolt air-launched ballistic missile program. Skybolt had been the weapon around which Britain's independent nuclear deterrent was being rebuilt. Without Skybolt, Britain had no credible means of delivering nuclear weapons from aircraft into the 1970s. Kennedy offered an alternative: Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missiles, to be sold to Britain at preferential terms. Macmillan accepted. The implications for the TSR-2 were not immediately apparent. Polaris was a strategic weapon carried by submarines, targeted at Soviet cities. The TSR-2 was a tactical weapon carried by aircraft, capable of supporting land operations as well as nuclear delivery. The two systems were not, on their face, in competition. But they were in competition for something more important than a target list. They were in competition for the strategic logic that justified their existence. If Britain's independent nuclear deterrent was now submarine-based, if the Polaris submarines of the Royal Navy's Resolution class could guarantee Britain's ability to threaten nuclear retaliation without depending on manned aircraft, then the case for maintaining a manned nuclear strike capability at enormous cost became progressively harder to sustain. Harold Wilson understood this when he won the general election of October 1964. His government inherited a TSR-2 program that had already spent approximately £195 million and was being described by Treasury officials as potentially reaching $750 million to £1 billion by the time the full production run of 138 aircraft was complete. The Treasury's analysis, contested by the Ministry of Aviation and by BAC, but not effectively refuted in Whitehall, was that the program was out of control. Dennis Healey, appointed Secretary of State for Defense by Wilson, conducted the defense review that sealed the program's fate. The review was not primarily about the TSR-2's technical merits. It was about what Britain could afford to be and still afford the welfare state that the Labour government had been elected to build. In that calculation, a 750 million size strike aircraft had no natural constituency. On 6th of April 1965, James Callaghan rose to deliver the budget statement to the House of Commons. In paragraph 71 of a document primarily concerned with taxation and public expenditure, 6 words appeared. "We have cancelled the TSR-2 program." 6 words. That was all. The program that had employed 14,000 people, that had consumed 8 years of engineering effort, that had produced the most capable strike aircraft of its era, was ended in a sentence shorter than the name of the aircraft. Here is the specific irony of this entire story. The characteristic that made TSR-2 operationally irreplaceable, its ability to fly at low level, below Soviet radar in all weathers, over enormous distances, with a nuclear or conventional payload, was identical to the characteristic that made it politically untenable. Because it could fly low and penetrate Soviet air defenses without depending on ballistic missiles or submarines, it represented a capability that the Treasury and the Secretary of State for Defense decided Britain no longer needed to pay for. Polaris could threaten Soviet cities. Therefore, the argument ran, there was no requirement for an aircraft that could do the same thing more flexibly, at shorter range with conventional as well as nuclear weapons, in direct support of land operations. The argument was wrong on its own terms. Polaris was a strategic deterrent. TSR-2 was a tactical strike aircraft. They were not substitutes for each other in any operationally meaningful sense. The engineers at Wharton knew this. The air staff knew this. The operational analysis was clear. The Treasury's argument was not an engineering argument. It was a budget argument wearing the clothes of a strategic one. Read that again. The aircraft was cancelled not because it could not do what it was designed to do. It was cancelled because what it was designed to do had been reclassified in a budget document as something Britain could no longer afford to need. The engineers were right. The machine worked. What failed was not the engineering. The engineering verdict on the TSR-2 is unambiguous and has never been seriously contested. The aircraft met its specification. The 24 test flights conducted between September 1964 and the last flight on 31st of March 1965 confirmed successively that the basic handling characteristics were as predicted, that the Olympus engines were performing within specification, that the undercarriage and systems were functioning correctly, and that the low-speed and transonic flight envelopes were behaving as the aerodynamicists at Wharton had calculated. Roland Beaumont, the most experienced British test pilot of his generation, stated categorically that the aircraft had demonstrated compliance with operational requirement or 339. That verdict stands. The institutional verdict. The institutional verdict is more complicated, and it belongs in a specific category. Death by but, framed as death by strategic review. The TSR-2 was cancelled, not because its costs were genuinely out of control. The program's actual expenditure in 1965 was within a range that had been forecast in 1963, but because the Treasury had decided, for reasons that mixed genuine fiscal constraint with political preference, that the program's projected total cost was unacceptable. The replacement ordered in its place, the American General Dynamics F-111K, was contracted at a unit price that was, by 1967, already exceeding the projected unit price of the TSR-2 in full production. The F-111K contract was cancelled in January 1968 without a single aircraft being delivered to Britain. The government that cancelled the TSR-2 on grounds of cost then cancelled its replacement for the same reason. The RAF flew the Blackburn Buccaneer, an aircraft designed in the 1950s for Royal Navy carrier operations, with a fraction of the TSR-2's all-weather capability and none of its supersonic performance at low level, as its primary strike aircraft until the Tornado GR-1 entered service in 1982. 17 years. The counter-argument that the TSR-2 program would indeed have overrun to politically unacceptable levels, and that the decision to cancel was therefore fiscally responsible, is made occasionally and deserves a hearing. It is not supported by the evidence. The Ministry of Aviation's own analysis, declassified from the National Archives at Kew, shows that the program's cost estimates in 1964 were being driven by Treasury projections that included contingency allowances that the engineering program did not, in fact, require. The verdict is this: The TSR-2 was cancelled for political and budgetary reasons that were dressed in the language of strategic review. The engineering case for the aircraft was sound. The institutional decision to end it was made on grounds that did not survive the test of subsequent events. It is the morning of 31st of March, 1965, a Tuesday. Boscombe Down, Wiltshire. The sky is overcast, a flat, grey, undifferentiated British March sky that gives no indication of ceiling or visibility until you are in it. The temperature on the ground is 4 degrees Celsius. A light northwesterly wind is moving across the apron at 8 knots. The windsock at the eastern threshold of runway 24 moves in a slow, half-hearted arc. XR-219 has been prepared overnight by the ground crew. The aircraft stands in the early morning light, white, longer than it has any right to be, its nose slightly elevated on the main undercarriage, its intakes gaping. The 2 Olympus engines are already being preheated. This is a condition of the test program. The engines require approximately 90 minutes of preheat before start to bring the turbine casings to operating temperature uniformly, preventing differential expansion that could cause blade rub. The ground crew know this routine. They have performed it before every one of the 24 flights. Rowley Beaumont arrives at the aircraft at 0840. He performs the external inspection, working forward from the port engine intake, checking inlet guide vanes, walking the leading edge of the delta wing, checking the engine exhaust nozzles at the tail. The checks take 11 minutes. He climbs the boarding ladder, settles into the Martin Baker Mk8 ejection seat, and begins the cockpit pre-start sequence. The start is normal. The Olympus engines spool up through their ignition sequence, the low moan of the starter motor, the hiss of fuel entering the combustion chambers, the rapid acceleration through idle-to-ground idle speed, and the sound that settles over Boscombe Down is the sound that the ground crew have come to recognize over 7 months of test flights. It is not a comfortable sound. It is a sound that organizes the air around it. XR-219 taxis to the holding point for runway 24 at 0922. Beaumont advances the throttles through the gate into reheat. Both engines light the reheat circuit simultaneously. The sound changes, drops in pitch and increases in presence, as if the aircraft has shifted register. And the aircraft accelerates down the runway. Rotation at 180 knots. Gear up. The aircraft climbs away to the southwest, into cloud at 1,200 feet, disappearing from ground view within 40 seconds of brake release. The flight lasts 52 minutes. In those 52 minutes, Beaumont explores the transonic acceleration envelope at medium altitude, confirms the handling characteristics of the aircraft at Mach 09, and makes 3 practice instrument approaches. Everything is normal. The aircraft responds to control inputs as the aerodynamics team at Wharton predicted it would. The systems function as designed. The engines perform within their specification. The aircraft returns to Boscombe Down. Beaumont lands, taxis back to the hard standing, shuts down the engines. The ground crew begin the post-flight servicing. They note the fuel state, check for hydraulic leaks, log the engine parameters from the flight data recorders. They do what they have always done after a TSR-2 flight. They expect to do it again on Thursday, when the next scheduled test is planned. None of them know. Not on this morning. 3 of the ground crew, their names are not in any record available from the National Archives, but they were there. Remain on the hard standing after the others have gone to write up their logs. One of them lights a cigarette. Another checks something on the port undercarriage that did not need to be checked. They stay for perhaps 10 minutes. Then they leave. The aircraft sits. 6 days later, Chancellor James Callaghan stands up in the House of Commons and reads out a budget. 3 things were lost when the TSR-2 program was cancelled. Not 3 general things. 3 specific things, irreplaceable, documented, and never recovered. The first was the terrain-following radar knowledge. The system being developed by Ferranti in Edinburgh was, in 1965, the most advanced low-level navigation and terrain-following avionics system in the world. The specific expertise, the understanding of how to digitally process radar returns at low altitude in real time and translate them into flight control corrections. existed only in the practice of building and testing that system, which ended on 6th of April 1965. The team dispersed. Some went to the Tornado program, where they rebuilt parts of their knowledge base over the following decade. Parts were sold under licensing arrangements to companies in the United States. The coherent body of knowledge that had accumulated at Ferranti's Edinburgh plant by March 1965 no longer exists as an entity anywhere. The second was the integrated engineering lineage. English Electric at Wharton, Lancashire, had maintained an unbroken chain of aircraft development from the Canberra in 1949 through the Lightning in 1954 to the TSR-2 in 1964. That chain carried within it not just technical knowledge, but a craft tradition. The specific way of understanding stress calculations, of reading wind tunnel data, of translating a design requirement into a flight article, that lived in the accumulated experience of draftsmen and stress analysts and systems engineers who had worked on all three aircraft. The cancellation broke the chain. Wharton continued as a BAC facility and later as British Aerospace, working on the Tornado. But the specific intellectual lineage of English Electric, the tradition that had made the Canberra the most successful British military aircraft ever built, still flying in 23 air forces when it was cancelled, was interrupted in 1965 and never fully resumed. The third was the capability itself. After the TSR-2, Britain built no supersonic strike aircraft of its own design. The Tornado MRCA was a collaborative program with West Germany and Italy, shaped as much by German operational requirements as British ones, powered by Rolls-Royce turbo Union engines developed internationally, procured at unit costs that reflected shared development and shared production. It was a capable aircraft. It was not a British aircraft in the sense that the TSR-2 was a British aircraft, designed from a British requirement, built at British facilities, embodying a specifically British understanding of what a strike aircraft needed to be. After 1965, Britain could build components of combat aircraft. It could contribute systems to collaborative programs. But the industrial and institutional capacity to design and produce a complete combat aircraft to a national requirement, in the way that English Electric had designed and produced the Lightning, the Canberra, and the TSR-2, that capacity was not maintained. The question that has never been satisfactorily answered is this: if the Tornado could eventually be justified at its actual cost, with its actual performance, why could the TSR-2 not have been continued to a comparable standard, at comparable cost, producing a British aircraft rather than a European one? No minister has ever answered that question on the record in a way that accounts for the F-111K. The TSR-2 was not cancelled because it failed. It was cancelled because the institution that funded it changed its mind about what Britain needed to be. Those are different things. The engineers at Wharton understood the difference. The Treasury did not. Operational requirement, or 339, expressed a specific British understanding of how to project military power in a contested environment. That understanding was correct in 1958. It remained correct in 1965. It remains, in principle, correct today. What changed was not the understanding. What changed was the political willingness to pay for it. That distinction matters. Not because the decision can be reversed, but because the same decision is made. In different rooms, in different years, with different aircraft and different programs and different budget lines, and it is always dressed in the same language. Strategic review, fiscal responsibility, changing requirements. The engineers hear those words and they know what they mean. They mean the machine will be cancelled. They mean the machine will be cancelled while it is working. Close your eyes. Boscombe Down, 27th of September, 1964. The two Olympus engines are advancing through the reheat envelope for the first time in an integrated flight. The sound is not what you expect. It does not announce itself. It arrives as a physical event, a pressure change in the air that reaches your sternum before it reaches your ears. Then the note rises, not louder but deeper, settling into a frequency below language, below thought, something that the body recognizes before the mind has time to classify it. The aircraft accelerates down the runway and lifts, and for 41 minutes, the most capable strike aircraft ever built in Britain climbs and turns and banks and returns. It is Tuesday morning in Wiltshire. The program is working. Everything is working. Open your eyes. It will not work for much longer. The engineers were right. The machine worked. What failed was not the engineering. It was the institutional willingness to understand what the engineering made possible and to sustain it long enough to matter. The TSR-2 is gone. The capability it embodied is gone with it. What replaced it? The F-111K that was never delivered, the Buccaneer that was never adequate, the Tornado that was built with 3 other nations' requirements embedded in its design. None of them were what the TSR-2 was. None of them could be. If you want to remember what Britain built and what Britain decided to stop building, subscribe. There are more stories like this. The engineering was always better than the decisions. We are not done yet.